Welcome everyone to today's web conference, Building a Foundation for Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence Prevention. Prevent Connect is a national project of Valor US, formerly known as the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the US government, CDC, or Valor. We have just a few objectives for our time together today. We want folks to be able to define primary prevention, as well as describe examples of prevention in the real world. And, we only have 90 minutes together, so we can't cover every single foundation of preventing sexual and intimate partner violence, but we do want folks to be able to identify resources to expand their prevention knowledge beyond this web conference too. And you'll notice Ashley and I are making an effort throughout this web conference to avoid a lot of the jargony words that are on the screen right now. For folks who are new to prevention or who remember when they were new to prevention, just informally in the poll, how many of you on your first day of prevention work knew what all of these words mean in relation to sexual and intimate partner violence prevention? I know I didn't. I know that I had to keep like a little pocket diary of what's the acronym and what does it mean for my first few months working in sexual and intimate partner violence prevention. So the goal of this web conference is that we want to make prevention more accessible. We know that prevention of sexual and intimate partner violence came from grassroots organizing, but that the field has also been professionalized in a way that has been really inaccessible for folks to join in. It shouldn't take somebody having a master's degree to understand what sexual and intimate partner violence prevention is when it's something that impacts all of us. So the goal of us today is to really simplify the language and the examples that we use to describe prevention. So that way we can bring more people into our movement, into our goal, and connect for a common goal of sexual and intimate partner violence prevention. And to start, we really want to know from you all, what does prevention look like to you? And Ashley, if you have any examples that you want to highlight that are coming up in the chat, or ways that you have seen prevention in your communities or in your experience, I invite you to chime in. I see we have folks saying that prevention to them looks like education, community outreach, social connectedness, and empathy. These are great responses.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tori. I am loving what I'm seeing coming up in the chat. And I'm just taking it all in. Changing social norms, working with younger folks, knowledge, increased protection, decreased risks. So I love everything that I see coming up. To me, when I think about prevention, that just means that we're providing and promoting opportunities for communities to live their best lives, right? We're creating environments where everyone has just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. And this includes a lot of things, right? There's lots of things that people need to reach their optimal health, including the presence of certain things and also the absence of certain things. What's great is that when we think of prevention in terms of creating spaces where people are able to live their lives in the most healthy, safe, and secure ways, then we can really find examples of prevention all over. Prevention is and has been happening in communities, in organizations for a long time, and they just might not use that language. They might not use that term. So, for example, I wanted to share something that happened in a community that I used to live in. I used to live in a city where the utility department, of all people, had a program that provided free trees twice a year to neighborhoods. And really the point of that was to create tree canopies over the years that would then reduce energy needs. And some neighborhoods would organize teams to plant the trees around the neighborhood. And this resulted in an opportunity for neighbors to meet each other and become more connected to each other and also to the community they lived in. So the utility department and the neighborhood tree planting teams, I think they would probably just not describe this program or these events as a strategy to prevent violence. And you know, this program alone probably wouldn't prevent violence, but it is an example of creating situations where communities are engaged and connected, and we know that that can have a positive impact. So that's just one example that I wanted to bring, but for you all in the audience, please keep your examples coming and we'll return. So one of the reasons, you know, we wanted to host this web conference is because, like Tori, you just said, we believe that the concept of prevention has to be accessible. Like you said, it shouldn't take a degree, it shouldn't take a 9-to-5 job to engage people in prevention. I believe that I should be able to explain prevention to my family and my friends and my neighbors in a way that makes sense to them, in a way where they can actually see the role that they can play in prevention. We really can't prevent violence without being able to bring more people along. And sometimes the language that we use just doesn't mean anything to most people. So I always like to, you know, imagine the change that we could make if people across communities, across employment sectors, across nonprofit orgs and government offices and the entertainment industry and, you know, every other sector you can think of, if we all got on board with preventing violence. And Tori, I'm wondering if you would take us through kind of your path to prevention.
Yeah, Ashley, you know, you had described, you know, how do we talk about prevention to our family, to our friends, to our neighbors? And for me, a way to talk about that is to talk about my own personal path to prevention, to being really involved in preventing intimate partner and sexual violence. So I am going to share that personal story with you all right now. So when I think back on the many influences on my journey to working in this field and really loving and being passionate about preventing sexual and intimate partner violence, I think a defining moment for me was when I was getting ready to go to college. So this was spring of my senior year of high school. I hadn't applied to any other colleges. I knew the one I wanted to go to. I had my acceptance letter, and I was just spending the rest of the year getting ready for that move. It was out of state and away from any of my family. So it was a big, big transition that I was getting ready for. And I remember one morning, my parents asked me to come over to the dining table and sit down and read a newspaper article. And the newspaper was a local newspaper to the college town that I was about to move into. And the article was about a series of druggings that were happening at bars and at social events, and the sexual assaults that happened after people were drugging other people's drinks. So I remember having a conversation with my parents about it, and my parents did talk a lot about personal safety, and that was definitely something that I absorbed before I went to college. But there was also a part of me thinking, you know, not everyone who is getting ready to go to this town or go to this college, not everyone's parents are having the same conversations with them. And it also made me think, you know, where are the parents sitting down their soon to be college students at the table and talking about how to not drug someone's drink or how to not commit sexual assault against someone? And I remember my parents' reassurance to me, because part of me, you know, being 17 years old and young and really worried about this was, oh, well, maybe I should just go somewhere else where it's not happening. And my parents very calmly and wisely said, this is happening other places. But a reassurance was that maybe because this is such a public issue at this university, that they'll take it seriously. And your time on that campus will be focused on prevention and on supporting survivors. So maybe they'll actually do something about it. So there was a there was a bit of a complication for me between being really grateful that my parents provided me with these skills and also being really frustrated that this burden of responsibility fell on me, a 17, soon to be 18-year-old who was traveling over 1,000 miles away to go to college to protect myself and my friends. While I was there, there was a Department of Justice investigation and a public reckoning with sexual assault on campus. And there was also a lot of victim blaming too. Some of the victim blaming that I had seen was during college orientation. I was an orientation leader, and conversations about the way that women dress were brought up in my orientation group. And that really made me realize that while sexual and intimate partner violence prevention on campuses is so crucial and necessary, it also needs to be happening so much earlier and be ingrained in all facets of our society. So that way, when folks get to their campus orientation, they're not victim blaming women on the way that they dress. So that's my personal story of how I came to prevention. And Ashley, I'm wondering if we can invite our audience to share in the chat, what is your personal path to prevention? I also want folks to keep in mind that the chat is public and it will be made public following the web conference with everyone's names removed and only initials provided. However, if you wish to not have your chat be made public following the web conference, please private message me or Ashley. So Ashley, as people are thinking and responding about their personal path to prevention, do you have any stories of your personal path to prevention you want to share with our audience today?
Yeah, thanks, Tori. So my path to prevention really started, I think, in childhood. I was really aware at an early age of the trauma that so many of my family members had experienced. And I had this real sense that the things that they experienced didn't have to happen, right? Like they weren't just part of life. They weren't like, they didn't have to happen. They should have been prevented. And I also thought if they hadn't happened, then all of our lives would have taken a different trajectory. And when I started volunteering at a rape crisis center and learned that sexual violence prevention was an actual thing, I was so happy. And really the rest is history. Like here we are today. So thanks for asking that, Tori. I know, it's always, I think, important when we're talking about the foundations of prevention to really think about, like, individually, what is our why? Why are we doing this? And that doesn't mean that we have to share that with anyone but ourselves, but just kind of grounding ourselves in why prevention matters to us has been a really important practice for me over the years. So while folks are, sharing, and thank you for those of you who are willing to share, and for those of you who are just taking time to reflect to yourselves, we just, really appreciate you being here and being interested in this conversation. And what I want to talk about now is what we call the moving upstream story. Like, how do we get to prevention? Why are we thinking about prevention? What does it mean? And so to illustrate this, there's this old public health story that many of you are probably familiar with. It seems that everyone tells it just a little bit differently, but it's a story that we often use to talk about the way we should be thinking about preventing sexual and domestic violence. And it's often called the moving upstream story, but the story goes like this. Let me try to make my dog stop barking at me. Okay, here we go. So one day a person is fishing by the river and they see someone being swept downstream. And this fisher jumps in to save the drowning person, and they successfully drag them back to safety on the riverbank. Okay, so they save this person, they're on the riverbank, they're so grateful that they were able to save this person. But not even a minute later, here comes another person floating down the river, also drowning and calling out for help. And so the fisher goes back into the water and they save this person too. But this time, before they can even sit down and catch their breath, here comes another person, and then 3 more people, and on and on and on. The fisher is just completely exhausted, completely out of breath, cannot possibly go on like this. And so what they decide to do is they run upstream to try to see, why are all of these people falling in the river in the first place? And when they finally make it upstream, they notice that it's really just a disaster. The bridge is super unsafe. It's falling apart. There's people that are pushing others into the river. There's no signs about, this unsafe bridge. It's not just one problem, but many, many problems. And so the fisher thinks to themselves, the only way to actually save people from drowning in the river is to address these issues upstream, to prevent people from falling in the first place. So there's the moving upstream story for you all. And I can tell you that when I first started learning about prevention, the story really helped me understand that while it's so incredibly important to save the drowning people, over the long term, it's not sustainable. And there's going to be people that we're not able to get to. We can't only be pulling people out of the water, right? That's just not, it's not a good solution. And in sexual and intimate partner violence prevention, we talk about the different forms that prevention can take. We can provide advocacy to survivors. We can raise awareness about sexual violence and give people information and resources. We can implement ways for people to reduce their risk. Excuse me. But we can also try to stop it from even being an option for behavior in the first place. And so to bring it back to our moving upstream story, advocacy would be maybe the fisher being willing to go out in the water and save the drowning people, right? We can think that that's our advocacy. Outreach and awareness might be putting signs up to let people know that there's a broken bridge. Risk reduction could be teaching people how to swim and providing them with flotation devices. But primary prevention would actually be fixing the bridge. The best option would probably be to do all of these things, right? Like, not one of them is going to have the impact that all of them would have together. But fixing the bridge would likely have the biggest impact. And it would also take the most time. And in violence prevention, that's true too. Primary prevention takes time, and sometimes I think because of the time it takes, it seems really out of reach to us, and it's often invested in less and not seen as important. So Tori, we're gonna move to another chat question, but I want to just check in with you and see if there's anything coming up in the chat that you wanted to pull out.
Oh my goodness, yes. Thank you, Ashley. I really just want to sincerely thank everyone for your openness and your vulnerability in the chat, connecting sexual and intimate partner violence prevention to your own personal story and things that you've experienced. Folks are sharing how sexual and intimate partner violence has impacted them throughout their life, or have impacted their friends or their family members. Folks are talking about how they got involved with a feminist collective in college, and that brought them to prevention. People are talking about having these conversations with their friends and discovering how pervasive the issue of sexual and intimate partner violence is, and how prevention is the way out. Prevention is how we keep this from happening to anyone else in the future, how we work to a future where we are beyond sexual and intimate partner violence. So I really, really want to thank everybody for what they've shared in the chat, the personal messages I've gotten too, and for folks sharing. And Ashley, I see that there's some folks are responding to our recent question about broken bridges too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tori, and thanks to you all for sharing. And so yeah, the next question is, in the moving upstream story, the fisher determined that people were drowning in the first place because the bridge was broken. And so if we kind of use that as an analogy, we're just wondering, in your communities, what are the broken bridges? What do those represent in your communities? And what do you need to be able to fix those bridges? And so I'm seeing things come up in the chat, Tori, about broken connections between communities, and the norm of silence around talking about sexual violence, the need for community trauma work. There's silence, isolation, devaluing of people with disabilities, toxic masculinity, systems of oppression, not teaching youth and having higher standards of behavior. This is so great. Keep those comments coming. But Tori, I want to pass it over to you to lead us a little bit deeper in this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I really appreciate folks in the chat making connections between broken bridges and systems of oppression and social norms around power and control and dominance. And we have just a quick video clip that we want to share with you all. This clip is of Lisa Parks from the Prevention Institute, and she was sharing on our National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence listening session on prevention about what prevention means to her. So we will listen to Lisa.
Safety from gender-based violence is found in the fabric of our relationships, in our families, and in our communities, rooted in values of love and mutuality and justice and collective care. So what we focus on when we're talking about addressing gender-based violence are distinct harms that are inextricably rooted and linked to other harms. So the solutions are also linked in communities. So in other words, gender justice is racial justice, and climate and environmental justice, and economic justice, and reproductive justice, and disability justice, and more. And that means we need to ensure that our plans and our actions reflect fundamental values of equity and solidarity and belonging to the land and to each other and power with, not the relentless competition and extraction and consumption and power over that too often dominates decisions in our communities.
So I really enjoy when we get to interact with Lisa always, but what I especially appreciate about this video clip that we have of Lisa is how wonderfully she describes and connects root causes of violence to sexual and intimate partner violence. So when we talk about what it means to be a root cause of violence, for me, what comes to mind is this symbol of a tree. And I think this is probably one of the simpler ways that I can describe what's a root cause of violence versus what's a symptom of violence to my family. So thinking back to the personal story of my path to prevention that I shared with you all, I had shared that part of that story included a young man at college orientation, really being adamant about his beliefs about women's clothing being the cause of sexual violence. And these are his very, very binary words. So when I see someone say that dress codes will prevent sexual violence, or if women or femme-expressed, femme-bodied people just dress or act differently, that will prevent violence. When I hear people say that, I see that they are identifying the leaves on the tree. They see the symptoms of violence. They think if we pluck all the leaves off the tree, that will get rid of sexual violence. However, as we know from anybody who's had to rake leaves in the fall in the front yard, those leaves will grow back. They may grow back a little bit differently. That may be maybe a symptom of violence will will be a little bit different than the victim blaming and body policing that we've seen before. What would help to prevent sexual violence would be to actually get down to the root and address the cause. What is it in that tree that is causing these leaves to come out and be super visible? How can we dig deeper and identify what is feeding this tree of sexual assault that creates these leaves of victim blaming and body policing? And this is just one example of the many ways that root causes of violence influence sexual violence and its symptoms that are readily visible to the general public. But for us as preventionists, we have a really great opportunity to, when we hear people identifying the symptoms of violence as a cause of violence, we have an opportunity to pivot and really show people how deep these roots of violence go and what is needed in order to change them. And I'm going to pass it over to Ashley now to describe, what exactly are the root causes of violence? What do we mean when we say that something is a root cause of violence?
Thanks, Tori. And so this is a tool. Hold on, let me get to the next slide. This is a tool that I came across years ago that has really helped me make the connection that oppression is a root cause of sexual violence. And so this is the sexual violence continuum that Lydia Guy Ortiz created back in 2006. And in this tool, you'll notice that there's a range of sexually violating behaviors, and those are depicted in overlapping circles on the gray background. And the background is really meant to be our society. The outer ring of our society is labeled on this diagram as norms to remind us that attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors really work in tandem with one another. They really reinforce one another. And in the center is a white circle with the word oppression. And surrounding that circle are overlapping circles with 6 specific forms of oppression. And many of these forms, folks actually called out in the chat as being why the bridges in their communities are broken. And so this is really meant to highlight the ways that oppressions are linked and are often experienced at the same time. And this image helps us see that all forms of oppression are root causes of these behaviors. And I'm going to go to the next slide so you can see that the shading of the circles was, done purposefully, that the darker shaded circles are things that are typically kind of seen in society. They're validated, they're taken seriously. And the lighter circles are kind of the ones that aren't taken as seriously. They're not really seen for what they are. But what this diagram shows us is that they're all connected, right? And they all come from what you're talking about, Tori, these root causes. And so I'm going to pass it back to you so you can take us even deeper into the root causes and the tree analogy.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I think this is such a great way to explain the root causes of violence. And, I also want folks to know that these root causes of violence contribute to the norms, or the norms that contribute to violence are upheld by these root causes too. So one of the ways that we can think about that, we can go a little bit deeper, dig deeper, if you'll allow the metaphor, into what the causes of violence are, and really look at the soil. So Guante is a spoken word poet. He's done a lot of work around sexual violence specifically, but he has this poem from 2014 called "How to Explain White Supremacy to a White Supremacist." And there's a line in it that I think works really well when we think about the soil of our tree of sexual violence. The quote is, "White supremacy is not the shark, but the water we swim in." So often when we think about sexual violence, we think of it as the violent person themselves. When we think about sexual and intimate partner violence, we think of who did it, who's the perpetrator. But when we look at prevention, we have to look more at what is the soil that allowed that tree? What is the environment that allowed sexual violence and intimate partner violence to occur in the first place? So these root causes of violence thrive in the soil that they're in. So how do we change those root causes? We change our environments and norms so that those systems of oppression, those forms of oppression are not acceptable. They can't thrive in soil that looks to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence. So we expand a little bit more on the leaves, the roots of sexual violence, and really look at what's in our environments, what's in the soil, and as preventionists, what can we change? And Ashley, I think with that, we will ask our audience another text chat question.
Yeah, Tori. So we would love to hear from you all. You know, in your communities, what do you see as the root causes of violence? What are the pollutants that are in the soil, so to speak? And I have to, you know, just share, there was a comment from Alberto about it's frustrating because in my community, it's beyond the bridge. It's not just the bridge, but the road that leads to the bridge and the intersections leading up to the broken road that leads to the fallen bridge. And I think that that's really what we're getting at here, is that we can, you know, it's so important for us to go upstream to the root. And I'm seeing things come in the chat, Tori: racism, oppression, sexism, a rural silent rule of silence, poverty, housing insecurity, intergenerational transmission of poverty, violence, masculinity being linked to dominance, white supremacy, transphobia, capitalism. I mean, they're coming in fast, Tori. But this is exactly it. These are the roots. These are what's polluting the soil.
Yes, I really, really appreciate folks bringing up all of the soil pollutants that they're seeing that are contributing to those root causes. And I know a lot of them will be social norms that we talk about later. I also see that there are things that, you know, put everyone in communities at risk too. So I think we should, oh, there we are. Okay. So to think a little bit more about this like soil and plant metaphor, there is a popular quote called "Bloom where you're planted." And I really appreciate the Body Is Not an Apologies Instagram take on this quote, because I think it really it connects really well to what we're discussing here today. So don't bloom where you're planted, but grow to find a place where you thrive. And in this Instagram caption, it expands a little bit further. And I think this is the key connection we can think of when we think of prevention. What would it look like for the soil you're in to actually provide the nutrients and sustenance you require and desire? When we talk about changing the soil, it's one thing to know there's pollutants in the soil, but it's another thing to know, what does my soil need in order to create communities beyond sexual and intimate partner violence, to create healthy, safe, and thriving communities? And Ashley, I know that this brings up a question of, you know, what's the difference between awareness and prevention? Can you bring our audience through that conversation?
Yeah, I would love to. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between awareness and prevention. And when I first started working in prevention, I was at a community-based organization, and admittedly, I did a lot of educating and giving information. And, you know, as I look back and reflect on that, what I was doing was really important, right? If some folks maybe that I interacted with, they might not have received that information if I hadn't been giving it. But I thought a lot over the years about how what I was doing really stopped short of actual prevention. And so the reason is, okay, I'm going to try to stick with our plant and soil metaphor, Tori. So if I'm just telling people that the soil is bad, and that it doesn't have the right nutrients, right? Or even showing people like, okay, your soil's bad, but here's what we can do to work with it. Those things don't actually change the soil, right? I'm just giving information. I'm telling you it's bad. There's lots of pollutants in the soil, but I'm not actually changing it. In this way, I think we're kind of just accepting that the soil is bad. And because we have that awareness, we're trying to figure out how to work with it. How do we work with bad soil? But what I like to imagine is what would happen if we actually made plans to change the soil, right? That would be true prevention. If we did an overhaul of what we're planting in, instead of just making people aware of the problem of sexual violence, we also have to be thinking about how do we change the conditions in our society that allows violence to happen. And our text chat is a great example of all of the things that have been identified as creating the conditions. So how do we go about changing those conditions? I think that that is the real question. And Tori, I want to pass it over to you to kind of walk us through how we go from awareness to thinking about making some changes.
Yeah, I would be more than happy to to bring us along that conversation. So this is an example that we'll see another time in this conversation. But when I think of awareness and prevention and what the differences are, I also think that awareness can be a stop on our prevention journey. And I really saw that with when Me Too went viral in 2017, and Tarana Burke had said, "Me Too is my organization. I've been doing this work." And I think of the strength in the Me Too movement of being able to spread awareness about the pervasiveness of sexual and intimate partner violence. I think that was the first time in my life that I had seen people having really open and honest conversations about the sexual violence that they had experienced. When the hashtag went viral in 2017, to me, that was awareness. That was awareness building and awareness raising. We know it's been a few years since then, and we know that Tarana Burke and the Me Too movement have done a lot of work since then. We'll discuss that later. But when I think of building awareness about sexual and intimate partner violence, the very first thing that comes to mind is Me Too in 2017. And Ashley, when we talk about awareness versus prevention, and you brought it up too, you talked about how prevention is changing the conditions. And I know some folks in the chat are asking too about risk versus protective factors, which are basically just things in our environment that either support violence happening or prevent violence from happening. But Ashley, can you start to help us understand what is the role of environment in changing conditions in preventing sexual and intimate partner violence?
Yeah, absolutely, Tori. So one place that I like to start at is with this quote from the Institute of Medicine, and I'll read it. The quote says, "It is unreasonable to expect that people will change their behavior easily when so many forces in the social, cultural, and physical environment conspire against such change." So when I think about what does it take to end sexual and intimate partner violence, I think that it includes a requirement that people change their behaviors, right? We need people to change their behaviors in order to end sexual and intimate partner violence. But in many ways, behaviors that create harmful situations are also really rewarded in many different ways, and made easier by our physical environment. Okay, so I'm gonna give an example. It's not a perfect example because, of course, violence is much more complex than what I'm about to share with you all. But it helped me really make some of these connections. Okay, so Who is familiar with these images on the screen? And feel free to use the chat, if you're familiar with it, what is it? What did these images tell us? And I see the first, yep, I remember from school, the food pyramid. Yes. Okay, great. So it sounds like people are familiar with this. Go ahead and also put a yes in the text box if you feel like you have the information about what a quote unquote healthy diet looks like. Okay, do you feel like you have a pretty good idea of what a healthy meal would be? Okay, so I see lots of yeses, generally yes. All right, so now my next question to you all is, how many of you feel that you would genuinely feel good if you ate that way? Right, like what a healthy meal is, and if you ate that healthy meal at every meal, do you think you would feel good? See lots of yeses. Hey, it would be a good thing. But now tell me, do you eat this way all the time? Now I'm seeing all the notes. Okay, love it. So here we go. Let me get a little personal with you all. So the knowledge that I have about nutrition and about health and about what fuels my body really has convinced me that I should be eating like this. Okay, so I have an image on the screen that it's like a grain bowl. There's an egg and some tomatoes and avocado, and it's a bunch of whole foods. There's plenty of vegetables and there's protein, and I truly believe that those things are important, and if I ate that way, I would feel really good, right? I know that when I do eat that way, I feel good, right? So I believe that. I know that. I have the knowledge. I buy into it. I believe it. But at the same time, okay, there are a lot of reasons why I don't make that choice on a daily basis. Okay, lots of choices, lots of reasons, I should say. Sometimes I just don't want to, right? Sometimes you for many reasons, it doesn't sound good. That's not what I'm craving. There's also times where I don't make those choices because, maybe I'm running late somewhere and I don't have time. It takes time to make something like I just showed you, a grain bowl. Maybe I haven't made it to the grocery store. There have been times in my life where I honestly didn't have enough money to buy that kind of food. There's also something about my environment that when I leave my house and so I live rurally, and when I leave my house to head into the city, I drive by. This is the actual Starbucks and McDonald's I drive by. And so it becomes really easy for me to make another choice, right? It can be cheap, maybe not Starbucks, maybe not McDonald's these days either, but sometimes there's cheap things. It's faster. Sometimes those things just sound good. Sometimes they're the only things I have access to. And so even though I have the knowledge that a breakfast grain bowl would be the best choice for me, there's a lot of things that sway me away from actually making that decision, actually making that choice, actually, saying that that's how I'm going to eat at all times. So just having the knowledge doesn't mean that my behavior is going to change. All right, let's look at another example. And this little cartoon is using a different public health issue, okay? So again, it's not illustrating sexual or intimate partner violence. This one is actually looking at, I believe, diabetes. But it also is a great way to illustrate environment and behavior change. Okay, so in this little illustration, let's say that I'm a doctor and Fred is one of my patients. Okay, so we see a little cartoon Fred, he's my patient, and I'm gonna tell him that he needs to adopt some healthy behaviors and to do his best to stop the unhealthy ones in order to help manage his diabetes. Okay, so I'm his doctor, I'm telling him these things, and I'm probably going to give him an easy to follow schedule for taking his insulin. And I might also give him a brochure with some healthy eating tips. Okay, so I'm giving him information, I'm trying to help him with his medication management. But as a doctor, I'm not going home with Fred. right? I'm not going to be by his side throughout the day as he's faced with decisions and behaviors. The fact is that Fred is part of a family, part of a community. Fred might be he's part of a culture. And so all of those things, his family, his community, his culture, those things could also affect how he behaves. So to best help Fred, we need to also promote healthy behaviors throughout his environment, throughout the environment that Fred lives, works, plays in. So for example, Fred may be more likely to take his insulin if his friends and family know his schedule and help remind him. He's more likely to eat healthy if fresh food is available in his neighborhood. He may be more likely to get daily exercise that his doctor has encouraged if his health insurance includes a gym membership, right? So there's lots of ways to support Fred throughout the environment that he lives, plays, and works in. But, you know, this is like a dream situation that someone would have all of this, all of these resources available to them. We know that that's typically not the case. But I think it's a really good illustration of how we can implement ways to support people in making decisions, in changing behaviors. And so, you know, like I said, even though it's not sexual violence is very complex. We're talking about like a disease or a medical condition. I think that there are still illustrations of how our environments do impact us and the decisions that we make or that we don't make. Tori, I want to pass it back to you just to see, you know, what's coming up in the chat, and then to talk a little bit more about some examples of what some of those supports could look like.
Yeah, of course, Ashley. You know, when you were describing the connection between the information we have, the knowledge we have, and our environments, folks were making some really great parallels in the chat that sometimes the information that's given to us is from a very status quo establishment that is interested in upholding systems of oppression. So for example, saying that the like white Western medicine and white Western health standards are oppressive to a lot of people, and that discount a lot of people's circumstances and culture, etc. So I really want to thank people in the chat for bringing that up, because I think it connects really well to sexual and intimate partner violence prevention too. I think that you know, folks often look to this heavily researched curriculum, and what we know about at least one of them is that that curriculum doesn't work for example, LGBTQ+ youth. We know that it can take a lot of resources to implement this, and we know that something that makes sense to one person on paper isn't going to make sense applied into another community, or doesn't fit the needs of that community. So I really appreciate people in the chat making those connections in the example that you shared, and just wanted to bring that example back to sexual and intimate partner violence prevention. Monty also brought up in the chat that you know, maybe we live in a food desert or don't have enough money to buy the food we want, and food deserts result from racist public policy and laws. We have seen how institutional racism and structural oppression have created the environments where sexual and intimate partner violence thrive. Similarly to the example that you were showing us, Ashley, about how just because we have the information and the knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that is what that is what is going to prevent violence. It takes changes in somebody's environment, and those changes being driven by communities and being useful for communities too, not just something that's a very top-down prescriptive approach. So I really want to thank folks in the chat for bringing that out during Ashley's examples. And I want to provide an example that that relates to sexual and intimate partner violence. So a lot of the times when folks are looking at changing environments so that they prevent sexual and intimate partner violence, folks are looking at economic supports. So we recently had a web conference with someone from the organization Free From, and they provided a really great overview of how communities can change economic supports to prevent against violence, things like paid leave, things like paying people a living wage, providing survivors a cash safety net where they can use it however they want. It's not something prescriptive, survivors know best, and how organizations can better economically support those involved in the movement too. So when we talk about changing our environments to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence, economic supports is pretty frequently a strategy that people gravitate towards. And Ashley, I think before we move on, we have one more question for our audience.
Yes, we definitely do. So let me put it in the chat, but we would love to hear from you all about what are things in your environment that promote or prevent violence? Right? So if you can think of things that you see in your environment, and you might put an S on that because we walk through multiple environments throughout the day. So what are things that you're noticing in your environment that promote or prevent violence? Tori, I'll pass it back to you as we give folks time to respond.
Yeah, of course. Feel free, folks, to keep adding to the chat. I think where my mind first goes when I think about what are things in my environment that promote or prevent violence, I also have to think of what is in an environment. It's a very broad term that encompasses a lot of different things. So an example that I can really relate to when thinking about what's in an environment is thinking about a beach. So I live in Northern California. So in Northern California, there are many different things that impact the environment of the beach. There's the physical space and the physical elements, but there's also the culture. In Northern California, our beaches are pretty relaxed and playful. There's respect for the land and water. You can often see people doing beach activities or sports, or like me, trying to get your dog as close to the water before she panics and runs away. There's also the economic factor of beaches. Is there parking? How much does it cost? Is it affordable and accessible to get to a beach? Is there a boardwalk that has, shops and resources and things like that? What are the actual policies of the beach? For example, I have to find a beach that does allow dogs. Not all beaches in Northern California do that. Are there access policies about when you can come in and how close for high tides? And then there's also the social norms that work silently to shape our behavior. There's no sign on the beach that says, don't wear your tennis shoes. But for the most part, folks are wearing sandals. It's easier to not get so dirty. There's the social norms of you pack out what you pack in, you leave no waste behind. So these are all silently working to shape behavior. And then further going off this example, and I think this brings up a lot of what folks were talking about in the chat, different beaches have different norms. I'm talking solely from my experience in Northern California. And I know that what I experience on my Northern California beaches are very different than what my friends on the East Coast experience on their beaches, or what folks in other countries may experience on their beaches too. And so I think it's important to know that, what works to prevent violence in one environment, like if we're thinking about schools, what works to prevent violence in one school may not be a exact copy and paste to what works to prevent violence in another school, in another district. So it's always really important to know the environment we're in, knowing our audience, and knowing, what strategies and approaches work best. So one of the things that I had brought up when talking about what's in an environment is the social norms. So social norms work silently to shape our behavior A really great example that a former professor of mine had always shared about social norms, this was pre-COVID, so maybe it's changed since then. I haven't been in a lot of elevators in the last 2 years, but when you're in an elevator, how do you know to face forward, to give respectful space, to wait for the next elevator if it's crowded, like the one that's on the screen? We also know that depending on where we are, different cultures dictate personal space on things like elevators. So maybe, and where we are in time too. In 2019, this was probably a very familiar elevator scenario for a lot of people who used elevators. Whereas, you know, when I have seen a crowded elevator since then, since the coronavirus pandemic, I've been like, count me out. I will wait 15 minutes if I have to get on a less crowded elevator. Whereas before, probably wouldn't have done that. But that again goes to, nobody told me to do that. There actually wasn't any sign limiting capacity at the elevator that I'm thinking of. That was me thinking of, you know, what is happening in my environment, and what are social norms that I want to uphold. And for mine, in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic and before, it's respect for people's personal space. This is also really important to think about in terms of sexual and intimate partner violence, thinking about social norms, is that these aren't explicit. There's nobody walking around telling people how to behave or act, and folks may or may not be listening to that too. Especially when we think of our work with adolescents and with youth. You know, so often when folks talk about peer pressure, it's not explicit. It's more so the social norms. No one's being specifically told, or not very often being explicitly told, drink the beer or we won't think you're cool. So social norms are much more sophisticated than that. And that's why we have such a great opportunity to change and shape social norms away from norms that prevent violence, or away from norms that promote violence and towards norms that prevent violence. So one of the tools I want to share with you all to think about social norms change are the resources from Veto Violence around social norms change. So when we talk about changing social norms, what we're talking about is that we're changing attitudes, beliefs, and community values. And Ashley had already shared earlier about how all of these attitudes, beliefs, and community values can shape our environments and shape the acceptability of violence, or the protection against violence in our communities too. And as I promised, we are going back to our Me Too example. So when we talk about changing social norms, that is so rooted in prevention. And so we talked about how Me Too in 2017 was really this huge awareness building. And since the attention on the Me Too movement, Tarana Burke has introduced Act Two, which is a way to mobilize people to change norms, beliefs, attitudes, community values in their communities to prevent violence. So we're going to watch this very short clip from Me Too and Tarana Burke.
On October 15th, 2017, two words changed the course of history. The words we wrote that day are a part of a longer and even more powerful history.
The wounds become scars.
Things are changing.
We really need everyone's voices.
Today, we all have a chance to write another chapter, powered by everyday activism as simple as joining a march or reading a book, written to a permanent archive on a public blockchain.
Because it takes a sea of us coming forward to demand change.
Because no matter who you are, you can act too. The end of sexual violence begins with this next act.
So I think that's just such a great example of, one, making prevention really accessible, Tarana Burke had said that it begins with our next act, and everyone can do, very accessible things, whether that's go to a march or read a book or talk to family or friends. It feels a little more accomplishable to us as individuals and in our communities. So a lot of what is on that platform is addressing these 5 key norms of preventing sexual and intimate partner violence. So the folks at Prevention Institute have identified these 5 key norms that can either contribute to violence or prevent sexual and intimate partner violence. So the first one, culture of violence, we here in the United States, we exist in a culture that thrives on conflict and violence being a way to solve problems. And there's also a lot of excuses for those who are violent. Things like, they're the star player, or let's separate the art from the artist, or, someone being a key fundraiser. There's a lot of excuses for why someone behaves in a violent way. And that's a very dominant norm that I think is changing a little bit, but is still fueling sexual and intimate partner violence. We also notice that one of the norms are very narrow definitions of masculinity, which can not only promote violence, but can really harm those who do identify within the masculinity spectrum, can really prevent them from getting the resources and support that they need should they experience sexual or intimate partner violence too. So some of these norms are around dominance, control, risk-taking. We also see one of the norms is around limited roles for women. Within that, we see that folks who are women or feminine or femme-bodied or femme-expressed have a lot of norms around compliance and sacrifice. And then there's that element of victim blaming, or placing all the responsibility of prevention on women or femmes. We also see the norm of power and control. How many movies have we watched, or conversations have we had where we've just said, oh, that's just the way it is. The person who's powerful is the one who exploits people who have less power. That's another very common theme and norm that we see throughout this umbrella of rape culture that covers these norms of sexual and intimate partner violence. And then finally, and Ashley's going to go in more in depth with an example of this on the next slide, but there's the norm of privacy and silence. We have this norm in our culture about anything sexual is none of my business. And a lot of the time, sexual violence and intimate partner violence gets conflated to falling under that anything that's sexual is none of my business category, or it's a home matter, it's a family matter, it's a private matter. So Ashley, I'm really curious if you can go in on the next slide and dive a little bit deeper into that example.
Yeah, thank you, Tori. And this is one of the norms that came up a lot in our chat. I saw multiple people talking about seeing, their community seeing sexual violence as like a private issue, or there's lots of silence around the issue, so there's not conversations happening. And I think that there's a real connection between this norm of privacy and silence and how we often really tend to focus, like you said, on the individual experiences of sexual violence, and they get considered as a private experience instead of seen as a community issue and part of a larger culture of sexual violence. And so I think that when we allow privacy and silence to be a norm, we really are hiding patterns of abuse, or hiding the context that violence often happens in, and the things that contribute to violence, the things that condone violence, And in some ways, this ends up being one of the reasons why violence often gets ignored, because we're not able to see those larger patterns, and we're not able to make the connections around, you know, what's contributing to this if we're just looking at them as individual sexual experiences. And I think we have another question for you all, but I believe it's in a polling format. And so of those 5 key norms that Tori just walked through, which one do you feel you have the most power to change as part of your prevention efforts? And so again, it's culture of violence, narrow definitions of masculinity, limited roles for women, power and control, and privacy and silence. And there are many other norms. These are just 5 key norms that were identified by Prevention Institute. And I'm seeing lots of participation in this. It looks like, gosh, they're pretty split, but it looks like folks are feeling like they have the most power to change the privacy and silence norm, followed by the culture of violence norm, and then power and control, limited roles for women, and narrow definitions of masculinity follow. So thank you all so much for participating in that. I think we can go ahead and end this poll now. Okay, so one of the things that I think is really important to bring into the discussion is, you know, we go back to our moving upstream story and the bridge and the fisher and the drowning people. What that story really kind of leaves us with is how do we have the biggest impact, right? Like, what can we implement to have the biggest impact? And we can think about how we move from trying to reach individual people to being able to impact entire communities. Okay, so here's another analogy that isn't perfect because violence is a much more complex issue, but I want to invite you all to think about seatbelts for a minute. So getting in a car and putting on a seatbelt, that wasn't always the norm, but I think through a combination of education, policy, and social marketing, it really has become a norm. You know, personally, I don't even think about putting on my seatbelt. It's just something I do automatically. But also, nobody ever individually talked to me about seatbelts, right? To my knowledge, people who are very passionate about seatbelts and seatbelt use are not going around trying to reach individuals about the importance of seatbelts. Instead, they're using policies, they're using social marketing tools like signs on, you know, highways, and all of those things together have had an impact on our behavior and have created a new norm where seatbelt use is something that's a norm. And when folks don't use it, then, you know, that's something that people look at. And I'm looking in the chat, I see bullying. Okay, this might not be related to what I'm saying. I'm sorry. I just saw the chat functioning and wanted to pop over and see what the conversation was. And so when we think about, like, how do we have the biggest impact, you know, again, we can think about policy, we can think about social marketing, we can think about social norms, change campaigns. Those things don't necessarily, you don't necessarily have to participate in the intervention in order to be impacted. So you don't have to go to a workshop. You don't have to go to an event to be impacted by some of these approaches and strategies. And I think that is a really exciting thing that it's probably, it's not feasible for us to reach every single person on this planet to have a conversation about sexual violence and build knowledge. But what we can do is we can look at some of these other strategies that would impact large amounts of people and don't require us to individually reach them all. And Tori, I'd love to go into, I think we have another clip for folks that kind of talks about like how do we have the bigger impact and connect to other causes in our communities.
Yes, we definitely do have another short clip to share with folks, and it's from the same web conference that you all heard Lisa speak on earlier. This clip is by Farah Tanis, the co-executive director of Black Women's Blueprint, and it's a little bit longer. It'll be about 4 or 5 minutes, but Farah really does an incredible job of showing us that we are not alone when we are preventing sexual and intimate partner violence. There are so many other social causes that are tied up within ours, and really shows how we can connect across all sorts of things that people are passionate about. So we will hear from Farah.
We really want to begin by talking and acknowledging the number of disasters occurring, including earthquakes abroad. I am from Haiti, earthquakes abroad, fires and floods across the US. In New Jersey and New York, where I live, people are experiencing blackouts, lack of clean water, and of course, safety issues for women and girls and other vulnerable people are being assessed, and we are keeping a close eye on that. This is superimposed on a COVID pandemic and widespread poverty and risk of houselessness. But we know that disasters in particular, right, they're not new. Health crises are not new in this field. As the conditions that increase sexual violence and disasters are exposed, there is opportunity to create prevention programs, build coalitions, and enact policies that support meaningful prevention, not only in times of crises and disaster, but at all times. Yes, preventing sexual violence requires including multi-system, multi-sectoral responses, addressing issues of reproductive health, homelessness, food insecurity. Every one of us needs to see the major role we play as one person. One strategy, one organization cannot succeed in preventing violence without the success of all in our ecosystem. However, I want to emphasize one thing: engaging land and environmental justice, and work with climate change advocates. After our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, reconciling with self and others were two top priorities, but equally important was reconciling with the environment and the land. We need to work across sectors, as most of you have already said, working with climate change advocates who can offer lessons and ways to prepare and prevent violence for generations to come, as these are tied to environmental justice issues. Government approaches need to focus on financial resources and technical assistance to communities of color interested in working at these intersections. Black women, for example, who see land justice as prevention, as that has been practiced abroad, need to be supported, and their work needs to be bolstered. Land justice promotes solidarity economy. It promotes solidarity economy, which in turn increases food access, alternative health access, restorative justice practices, and an interruption in the cyclical relationship between poverty and violence, a strategy that invests in women's leadership, not just as heads of organizations, in trans and LGBTQ leadership, not just as heads of organizations, but at the community level, helps build legacy and the transfer of wealth, the transfer of agency to future generations. And it promotes decision-making on the part of the most vulnerable, us. We are the people we serve. I believe that shifting power is the way. I believe that that deep level of support is the way to promote those social norms that protect against violence, to teach those skills to prevent sexual violence, to provide those opportunities we keep talking about, to empower and support LGBTQ folks, the people with disabilities, women and girls, people of color, indigenous people. I believe that shifting power is the way to create these protective environments. It's in our hands. We, as the people most impacted, need to be supported, respected, trusted to build those protective environments.
I just love listening to everything that Farah just said. It makes me feel so much less alone. We have so many more allies within and beyond sexual and intimate partner violence that we can connect with. And I think what Farah shared really asks the question, you know, related back to the river story, the moving upstream story that we heard earlier. Who does it take to rebuild the bridge? And how can we help repair other bridges so people aren't falling into the water via other causes? Everything that Farah had shared speaks a lot to our collective power to prevent and end sexual and intimate partner violence. And so I just want to uplift a recent resource from Valor called Collective Power, a practical blueprint for sexual assault programs to create community partnerships and collaborations. So if folks were listening to Farah and thinking, well, how do I get involved with LGBTQ plus support communities? How do I get involved with climate change activists? I think this document, Collective Power, would be a great way for folks to build those bridges across causes and really think holistically about communities and sexual and intimate partner violence prevention. Another way that we've seen people connect across communities are from a couple of our previous web conferences in years past. We heard from Indiana about their Sidewalks to Access and how they changed environments to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence against community members with intellectual and or developmental disabilities, you know, and changing the environments to make people with intellectual and developmental disabilities feel more a part of the community and have access to things like transportation and parks and mobility to go to the places that they want to interact with people. I also think a lot about what Líderes Campesinas had shared on our web conference, mobilizing and organizing communities to end child sexual abuse, and how their mission is to strengthen the leadership of farm worker women to be the agents of social, economic, and political change to ensure their human rights. I think that connection to communities that is just beyond like a one-off prevention education program is so impactful and instrumental in preventing sexual and intimate partner violence across communities. It's such a great way to ensure that prevention continues beyond and has the greatest impact across the community, as Ashley was talking about before. Oftentimes when people think about having the greatest impact with sexual and intimate partner violence prevention, they think of policy. And we've seen a lot, at least here in California, we've seen a lot of legislation around individual behaviors. But something we want to lift up is the legislation and policy that is changing environments to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence. So we have the Promotoras, who are a group of janitorial worker women, part of Yabasta, who lobbied and succeeded in changing the California law so they get to be the leaders of their sexual violence prevention programs in their workplace, instead of having an outsider come in and give the prevention programs. The workers from Yabasta get to do it themselves. Another way that policy can change environments and not just behaviors to prevent sexual violence is through paid family leave. There has been emerging research on the impacts of paid family leave and its ability to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence. And we did a web conference a couple years ago about how all sorts of these economic policies, from paid leave to rent stabilization and other economic policies, can foster healthy relationships in healthier communities too. And finally, there are some very recent resources that will help guide folks on learning more about addressing the root causes of violence. One of them, which we just did a web conference on last week, is from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, called Back to Basics: Partnering with Survivors and Communities to Promote Health Equity at the Intersections of Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center and Prevention Institute published a document earlier or in late 2021 called A Health Equity Approach to Preventing Sexual Violence. And then finally, we encourage folks to check out the recordings from the prevention track at the National Sexual Assault Conference. The theme of the National Sexual Assault Conference last year was Advancing Equity and Ending Sexual Violence. And so I think before we go and wrap up today, Ashley, I think we have one more question for folks in the chat.
Yeah, thank you for walking through those examples, Tori. We'd love to hear from you all, as you continue on with your week. What are you already doing to prevent violence in your communities? And is there something that you're excited about maybe implementing as part of your violence prevention plan? We'd love to hear from you on that. So feel free to share with us. We just want to leave you with a few more resources because, as Tori said at the beginning, this is such a big topic. Even to build a foundation, we could spend lots of time. And so the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center has some e-learning courses that are really fantastic with prevention primers. And then also Prevent Connect, we have some e-learning courses that I think are great for beginners all the way through folks who have been doing this work for many years. So I will put a link to where you can access that. I think I'm putting multiple links in. And then finally, to dig deeper into kind of like what does the evidence say about prevention, we would encourage you to check out the Center for Disease Control and Prevention Stop SV technical package, which is lots of the examples that we gave today. Oh, thank you, Tori. You can find what the evidence says. You can read about how they could be implemented. And actually, I think there was a question about paid family leave and how that connects to sexual and intimate partner violence. There is a whole section in this technical package that will walk you through what that looks like and what some of the evidence is there. So Tori, it is the end of our web conference. I just want to thank everyone, and I want to pass it back to you because this is your last Prevent Connect web conference, but I'll let you explain.
Yes, well, first of all, I really want to thank our audience for being here today and for all of your engagement in the text chat. This is my last Prevent Connect web conference after 3.5 years. I am really excited to pass the hosting responsibilities on to the next new staff member. I'm still at Valor. I still have the same email for folks who have my email. I'll just be working on a different project other than Prevent Connect, but I really want to thank the audience here today, the audiences that we've had in the past, for really having such a lasting impact on me. I genuinely appreciate all of your connections and you all being here. And I'm really going to miss this audience. This is a really bittersweet moment for me. So Just want to extend my gratitude to you all. I would not be as happy in my career if I didn't have all of you to interact with. So that's it for me. I will sign us off today. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our captioners. Thank you so much, Ashley. Thank you, Claudia, for all of your support on this web conference today. This will conclude today's web conference. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And Ashley, we'll see you on the next one.